Starfield. Space Skyrim. Am I right? A massive RPG with 1,000+ planets? Well, doesn't that sound wonderful? Here it is. This is my first video review of a game ever, and I definitely bit off more than I can chew with it. I started this review while the game was still in early access, wrote and recorded everything in September, but I'm just not very good at video editing, so it took much longer to finish up than I anticipated. Real quick before I start, if you've already played the game, post your opinion of the game in the comments below for people who are still trying to decide whether or not they want to get the game. Anyways, I'm not going to waste any more of your time. Here's a spoiler-free, in-depth Starfield review.
Well, gentlemen, we have a newcomer. Place your bets.
So Starfield's out now, and if you're watching this video, you probably haven't gotten the time to play it, or you're still deciding whether or not you want to buy the game, and you're seeing a bunch of like very conflicting reviews. You know, you have people who are giving it 10 out of 10, saying it's like a masterpiece, and then you have people that are basically saying the game's not even playable. But the thing is with these reviews, a lot of times they're basing their opinions on like very vague statements. So you hear things like, oh, this is like the greatest RPG or whatever, and you're probably like, okay, in what way? And a lot of the positive reviews really aren't going into depth of like what's good about it, you know, and a lot of the things that they are praising about the game are like really outdated. So a lot of people that I'm seeing that are praising the game as like a perfect game, they're really fascinated with how many objects you can grab and move around, like as if you couldn't do that in Skyrim over a decade ago. But so yeah, I wanted to give a much more in-depth review without going into any spoilers, because I feel like a lot of the videos on Starfield aren't explaining why you might like it or why you might not. It's a bunch of vague statements and it's not really helpful. So before I really get into the details, is the game good or not, it's okay. There is a lot of room for improvement in the game, which is kind of unfortunate given how long it's taken for the game to come out. So like if you have Game Pass or whatever, you know, you'd play it, but you know, so like on like a scale of 1 to 10 or whatever, I'd probably give it like a 7.5, maybe an 8, but definitely not higher than that. And I'll obviously go into why. Like, it's not like a horrible game or anything, it's just compared to its predecessors, it leaves a lot to be desired. Alright, so the first thing we have to get out of the way is the performance. The game has a lot of performance issues. You have crazy texture pop-ins, ridiculous audio bugs, endless load screens, frequent game crashes, you know, frame rate issues, various bugs, and, you know, pretty much everything you can imagine, but not to the point where it's unplayable. Well, I say that, but the first day of the early access, the game was actually unplayable for me. It would freeze constantly, and like none of the audio is like synced in with people's mouths, and it was a mess. I reinstalled the game and the issues were much less frequent. So, you know, if you do get the game and you're having significant issues, you might want to try reinstalling it before trying to get a refund, see if that works. I don't know. But yeah, just overall, the performance is not the best. So an RPG of this size is expected to have a ton of bugs, regardless of who the developer is, really. The more ambitious a game is, the more bugs you're going to have. That's kind of just how it works. But then the more bug testing you do, the more effort you go into cleaning up the game, then the less bugs it has by the time of release. And so ideally, by the time a product is released, you know, it should have gone through enough bug testing and quality assurance that the product releases as a decent playable product. But there's this concerning trend of games constantly being released unfinished and just filled with issues that should never have made it to release, and I kind of feel like Starfield fits that category. It's not the most like egregious example ever, because again, a game of this size is simply going to have more bugs than your average game, and I would say it has its fair share of bugs, but it's not like game breaking most of the time. And so you're probably wondering what I play on, right? That is an important detail. So I'm playing the game on PC. I have a decent setup, well above the recommended specs. My PC is quite a bit more powerful than the Xbox Series X, so there's really not much of an excuse there. There's also the fact that like there's a lot of examples of people with the best PCs available still having performance issues, you know? So just all around, the performance is not the best. So while subpar performance is kind of to be expected with a game like this, I don't really think it's an excuse. I do think games need to be released in a better state than this, and it can be really frustrating when they're constantly released with issues that simply shouldn't be there. But yeah, Todd Howard says just get a better PC or whatever. So yeah, playable but not great, I would say.
Can I help?
So at a glance, the gameplay is very similar to like Fallout 4 or Fallout 76. There are quite a bit of differences. But the first thing I want to get into, like before the rest of the gameplay, is the settings. Why is this game lacking in settings so much? Why is a game in 2023 releasing without a field of view slider? That's just ridiculous. And I mean, there are already mods to fix it, but it's just like, why is that not in the game to start with? That's crazy. There's a lot of other little things that really should be in the settings that just aren't. You know, it is just one of those things where it feels like I don't know if you call it an oversight or just didn't have time to get around to it or just even laziness. I don't know. But it's things that really should be in the game that just aren't, and it's weird that they aren't. Okay, but now that's out of the way, now we can talk about combat. The majority of the game is combat. So while there are a lot of like RPG elements to the game and like you can talk your way around certain instances of combat, combat as a whole isn't avoidable. So while there is other stuff to do in the game, combat is going to be like the majority of what you do in the game. And it's very similar to Fallout 4 or Fallout 76, with the exception of there is no VATS for targeting. The combat is a lot smoother than Fallout 4, and like I like the way the recoil is a lot better. And overall it feels a lot better. And there's a lot of cool things that happen in combat when you're like in low gravity and boost packing around. And sometimes you're in literally zero gravity. Combat in zero gravity is really cool. An interesting design decision that they made was to replace stamina or action points with oxygen, which is pretty interesting. Sometimes you have to watch and manage your oxygen during combat. I mean, it's basically just stamina, but rather than getting like exhausted after a while, you run out of breath and you take damage instead of not being able to do stuff, which I personally like because a lot of times it saves time. Like if I'm over encumbered and I'm just trying to get somewhere, like, yeah, I can take some damage and then go heal once I'm on my spaceship or whatever. But there is a big issue with combat, and that's that enemies are all like bullet sponges. Like every enemy has a weird amount of health, like weirdly large amount of health. And then for whatever reason, some enemies randomly have 3 times the health. Like no explanation. They just have 3 health bars. It's not like any prefix on their name. There's no explanation for it. It's literally just some enemies have 3 times the amount of health. So have fun with that, I guess. You burn through ammo really fast, which, I mean, isn't too much of an issue, because you find ammo pretty frequently, and you can buy ammo pretty cheaply. Ideally, you're going to want to keep multiple weapons, so that when you burn through ammo of one weapon type, you just switch to another, and then you'll really have no problems. And that's another thing, is you're really gonna have no problem. I play on the hardest difficulty. I'm decent at video games, so I didn't expect it to be that difficult, but it's kind of absurdly easy on the hardest difficulty. The AI is not the smartest, and the DPS for a lot of the weapons for the AI is really low. You'll occasionally encounter an enemy using a weapon or like an alien that for whatever reason has a really high DPS out of nowhere, which the only times I've ever died is literally because I was so used to them doing 0 damage that when an enemy does half my health in one hit, I end up dying because I'm just like, oh, what? I was supposed to heal? I didn't even think about it. I haven't thought about healing in hours. Something I really liked that Starfield did was the different star systems have like a different difficulty level, which I really like when different areas have different difficulty levels because it gives you something to work towards. Plus, if you find the area you're in too easy, then you go to a harder area. The unfortunate thing is that even though you can go to like a level 75 star system like almost right away, and you will find like level 75 enemies, it's almost exclusively going to be like level 75 animals or whatever, and they very rarely have ranged attacks, so they're really not too difficult other than large pools of health. But enemies at all levels have large amounts of health for some reason, so it really doesn't feel that different. I like the idea, I just wish there was a bigger contrast between like a level 1 enemy and a level 75 enemy. And there definitely is a difference, it's just not as significant as I feel it should be. Especially when it comes to like human enemies, because how difficult the human enemy is more dependent on what weapon they're using. So the level indicator for them basically means nothing anyways. But it's just a shame because it's like, you even compare it to like Fallout 4, Fallout New Vegas, Skyrim, any other Bethesda game, they weren't as easy as this. This is just ridiculous. And yeah, this is just part of a trend that I've been noticing in games for quite a while that's incredibly frustrating, and it's super frustrating to see it in Starfield. You know, I feel like if you turn the difficulty up, the game should get harder. As far as I'm concerned, didn't. There's really no difference between the easiest mode and the hard mode that I could figure out. I mean, I'm sure the numbers are different, like I'm sure you are taking more damage. It's just not that noticeable. It's so easy to just heal if you get hit that it doesn't matter. And then there's a lot of different ways to like disrupt enemy attacks that are really easy to exploit. And only a few enemies can resist them, which makes it even more ridiculous. And so overall, the combat can be really interesting at times, but most of the time, it's not interesting at all. It really is like a blander Fallout 4 most of the time. But then again, it will also randomly surprise you with fun moments that just kind of come out of nowhere. It's just a shame that that's not how the game is all the time. You know, like, sometimes you'll encounter an enemy that actually has more than one attack, and can do interesting stuff. But most of the time, no. So going from there, there's skills, right? You have multiple trees, and a lot of the skills you probably expect. You have various combat skills that are very similar to Fallout's combat skills. You have the security skill for lockpicking. You have like a sneak skill. It's very reminiscent of Fallout. You know, there's the science tree, which has a bunch of crafting stuff. There's the tech tree, which is for your spaceship, which I'll talk more about in a second. So the skills aren't anything too interesting. You don't have any like wacky ones like you would in Fallout. They're all super straightforward. Each one has like 4 tiers that just increase like a stat boost or something. They're really uninteresting. But something I do like about the skills is that while there's 4 tiers of each skill, but you have to earn the upgraded skill, not just through like skill points, but also by completing a challenge that involves using the skill, which I like that setup personally. There are some moments where you're like, I just want to upgrade, like persuasion, for example. You're like, oh, I just want to upgrade my persuasion skill, but you have to have successful persuasion moments to upgrade it, but you're having problems getting successful persuasion moments because it's not upgraded. There's some stuff like that where it's kind of like, oh, that's weird. But for the most part, I think it's a pretty nice idea. It gives you a little bit of extra stuff to do that doesn't feel pointless. That's kind of like a random thing that I wasn't sure where to put in this video. But there's a lot of, like, compared to Fallout 4, there's a lot of, like, weird missing features. Obviously, there's no reason for VATS to be in the game. It's literally a Fallout thing. But there's, like, little things like you don't have a detailed map anywhere, which gets very annoying when you're in, like when you're inside of a location. You can see this little arrow that points you where you need to go, but it really just points to, like, your next quest, so that's assuming that you're going towards a quest. So if you just kind of want to explore a location, you just have to wing it. You can easily backtrack back to the beginning, but it's really easy to like miss interesting bits of dungeons just because you get lost. And I don't really have a problem getting lost, but I know a lot of people do. And so it's just bizarre that they didn't have a map in the game. Like, literally every game has a map. Why doesn't this game have a map? I don't get it. There's also, like, weird points where, like stealth just isn't an option. Like, it's not viable. Like, when you're floating around, there's no stealth. So it's like, I don't know, it's just kind of bizarre to me that they wouldn't think through how stealth would work while floating. And then a complaint I saw a bunch of other people make that didn't bother me at all was that the main character isn't voiced. Which, again, I personally think that it allows for more dialogue options, but a lot of people were frustrated because Fallout 4, the character was voiced. This is a step backwards, basically. And so, yeah, I can see what people are saying with that. And from there, we'll go into, like, probably the most disappointing aspect of the game. So, like, the game is big on, like, space exploration. The actual exploration aspect of the game is kind of horrible. Yeah, there's like 1,000 planets, but most of them are completely pointless. And then even on the planets with stuff that is interesting, exploring around the planet is completely pointless. You basically have key locations that are interesting, and then a bunch of procedurally generated filler that it's not interesting in any way. A lot of times, it's just poorly designed. You know, it's like, you go to a moon, you land on the moon, you walk around, you find a mining outpost that has pirates in it. Well, you do that once, and then you're like, okay, that was kind of neat. There was absolutely nothing interesting going on besides a little bit of combat and a little bit of loot. And then you realize that there's like thousands of those that just pop up, like, whenever. So it's like you did it once, you don't need to ever do it again. especially since a lot of the times the locations are identical. You will find identical locations on multiple planets. And then there's the wildlife, which, you know, you have various alien plants and animals, but they're often the same on various planets. Sometimes they'll even be the same with different names, indicating they're supposed to be different species, but they look literally identical, which is bizarre. And there are some animals where they have like a in-game explanation as to why they're on multiple planets, like heat leeches. You know, it's like a infestation. But most of the animals, there's zero explanation. And then even though there are different animals, a lot of the different animals that do look different look very similar. You have a bunch of these like floating jellyfish in the air species on a ton of different planets that don't really do anything. You can kill them and collect resources, I guess. But for the most part, it's very uninteresting, and only 10% of the planets even have life on them to begin with. And so the procedurally generated plants and animals are generally like very forgetful. There are some named animals that you'll fight, and they're normally the much more interesting animals.
Nasty kind of alien left behind after the colony war. Pretty much blind.
The most interesting, like, procedurally generated animal I've encountered was one that had, like, built-in chameleon skill, which is, like, kind of invisible, but not completely. And so I was like, oh, that's kind of neat, and then I killed them, and then I left, and then I don't care any, because there's really nothing more to it. You can scan them and find out more details about them, but all the details you find out about them, you could literally know just by killing them, or just by walking by them. So it's like, why does that need to be a thing? I don't know. But there are a lot of, like, minerals to mine or whatever, which, I mean, is kind of interesting to me, I guess. I'm not really sure why it's interesting to me, but it is interesting to me. But it's really not, like, something you have to look for. Like, you know what minerals are on each planet before you go to that planet, pretty much. So it's kind of just like, oh, I need aluminum. I'm gonna go to this moon that has aluminum on it. Gonna land. I'm gonna grab aluminum. I'm gonna leave. Now I have aluminum. Or if you want to build an outpost and you're like, oh, I use a lot of iron. I'm gonna build an outpost on this planet that has iron, and I'm gonna extract iron. And now I have iron. And that's it. You can't really do much with it outside of crafting, like most of the materials. You can sell them, but they're not worth their weight, so it doesn't matter. They're like half a pound each, and most of them are worth like 1 money unit. I don't even remember what the money's called in Starfield. But yeah, like 1 money unit or whatever in Starfield does not go far at all. So it's basically worthless outside of crafting. But I mean, there is some interesting crafting stuff going on. I do think the crafting is a little bit less interesting than Fallout 4. You can't like take mods off of guns. You just build them or delete them, basically. Same with armor. And I don't know, none of the mods are really that interesting. You'll just have like, oh, a grip increases aim down sight speed or something. And it's like, I don't care, the game's easy. I don't need increased aim down sight speed. Or a suppressor, it gives you a stealth attack bonus. Like, okay, that could be cool, I guess. I don't know. You know, I think supposedly there's like more weapon mods in this game than Fallout, but it kind of doesn't feel that way because a lot of the mods are more or less the same. They're not that interesting. You know, most guns can be like semi-automatic or fully automatic. That's like the biggest difference in terms of modding that you ever really see. Some guns will have sights, some guns will have suppressors, and some guns will be fully automatic or semi-automatic. That's pretty much the extent of the weapon modding in terms of like practicality. There's like a research crafting deal, which is kind of interesting. It's not actually crafting anything for you to directly use. It's basically you crafting recipes, which does just add another layer to crafting. There's also one that's just crafting supplies out of more common supplies. So I think that's interesting as well. But for the most part, the crafting's just okay. You know, if I'm being nice, I'd say it's on par with Fallout 4. I really don't think it quite is. In terms of exploring, you will occasionally stumble across a named location, and these named locations are generally quite interesting. The problem is that for every like named location you stumble across, you'll encounter like dozens and dozens of like abandoned mining outpost or something, and you go there and there's pirates, and it's like, okay, you just kill them, and then that's it. They might have some loot, and then loot has like different rarities. The different rarities are just an additional perk for the gun or equipment or like armor or whatever. You can't move them or remove them or anything. You're just like, it's good or it's not. But a lot of them are just like, oh, do extra damage to humans. I think one of the more interesting ones is you do extra damage in space, but less damage on the ground. And then you have a lot that are like, do like some sort of elemental damage, but you have like a random chance of each shot having an element on it. And there's really no difference between the elements as far as I'm concerned. Like fire damage and radiation damage both just do damage over time. So there's really no need for them to be different as far as I can tell. As far as I know, there's 3 damage types. You have like lasers, which do like extra damage to shields, which you pretty much only ever encounter on spaceships. Then there's ballistic damage, which is just like bullets and swords and stuff. They do like extra damage to normal health bars or whatever. And then you have like electromagnetic, which is non-lethal to humans. You can like knock people out with it and has like increased damage against robots. There's very little reason to ever use non-lethal damage in this game. Most enemies you fight are just nameless, and you have to kill people in the game, like, whether you want to or not. You can't do, like, a full peaceful run, so it's pointless to have non-lethal guns as far as I'm concerned. So an interesting part about Starfield that Bethesda's never done before, obviously, is the spaceship. The spaceship is pretty interesting. It works, I guess. You kind of just drive around in like 3D space, and yeah, combat for it's not that great. I don't really know what else to say beyond the fact that the spaceship's cool, but not actually that great. So the way combat works is you lock on to enemy ships, and then your weapons like home in on them. So basically the strategy is get behind the spaceship you're fighting and just follow them until they're dead, because they can't shoot behind them, and that's it. You just get behind them. They can't do anything. But you also can't do anything if you're fighting multiple ships, so sometimes you literally just have to leave. You have to jump away, because this is the one area where I guess the difficulty is actually difficult in some way. If you're fighting multiple ships that are about your level, you know, you could take 2 at a time pretty easily, but once you get to like 3 or 4, it starts getting difficult, and sometimes you'll encounter like 5 or 6, and it's like at that point there's really no chance of you winning, because if you're following one, you'll have like 5 behind you. It's like no matter how fast you use weapon parts to repair your ship, you're gonna die if they're like the same level as you. There will be times where your ship's just so much better than them that you can just ignore them, basically. But it is interesting, just kind of the random ship encounters you'll have. That's actually been some of the best dialogue I've seen. Just the random ship encounters you'll have. But at the same time, a lot of them are also just annoying. Like, a ship will come up and say something completely pointless to you, and then leave, and that's it. And it's like, cool, you wasted my time. Customizing the spaceship is pretty cool, just because it's kind of like base building, but then you're using the base everywhere you go. As opposed to the outpost, which everything you would do at an outpost, your ship already does. So it's... and you have to take your ship everywhere anyways, so it's kind of weird. I don't know. I don't really... The only point of Outpost really is to mine resources, but it's just as easy to just go out there and mine resources manually, I feel like. So yeah, the ship is really your base. There's an interesting mechanic called contraband, where it's kind of like, it has a marker kind of like stolen items, but instead of red, it's yellow, and it indicates that the item's just straight up illegal to have. Not just illegal to have because it's not yours, but just illegal to have entirely. And so it sells for a decent price, but you can only sell it to trade authority stores, not their kiosks, which is where you would normally sell stuff, because trade authority always has a kiosk you can sell stuff to right where you land at like any location with people at it. But to actually sell contraband, you have to find one of their stores, and their stores are all in cities that are generally policed by like different factions that are like the police or whatever, and so they'll scan you when you try to land in those cities. And there's various ways like around the scan. The only thing contraband does is you can sell it for a bit of money units or whatever. That's kind of it. It's neat selling it once. It's kind of just a hassle that often leads to me just ignoring contraband. It is worth the carry weight, but it's not worth the time it takes for me to go all the way to a trade authority to sell it. And that's another thing, is going places. You basically have to fast travel everywhere. You're constantly fast traveling. But there are some areas that didn't need to be connected that are, which is extra annoying. Because it's like, you're already fast traveling all the time in the game, and then here's a city with a ton of performance issues, and it's in the same area as a desert and some procedurally generated stuff to explore, and maybe like a named cave or something. And it's like, why not make the city a separate area then? Everything else is already... I don't understand what they're doing here. It's like they want performance issues. But so yeah, if fast traveling's annoying, too bad. I feel like half the time I've spent playing the game has been in fast traveling screens, or like in the process of fast traveling, like looking at a map to fast travel. You spend so much time fast traveling, which, I mean, you kind of had to. Like, there's not much they could do. You're in space, everything's so disconnected and far apart, and the planets are so massive, but it is just kind of one of those things where it gets old fast. And overall, the gameplay has a lot of potential, but it constantly falls flat in weird ways. There's a lot of like surface level depth to the game that seems really cool. Like, the game looks like a lot of attention to detail was done, but then you go and kind of explore those details and they're not fleshed out at all. They have zero depth to them, basically. You know, a big example of this is food. There is a ridiculous number of food items in the game, and they're all very detailed. They're actually interesting. I like looking at the different types of food in the game, but gameplay-wise, they're useless. It's like, heal 5 points. So you start with about 200 health at level 1, but it quickly goes up as you level up. And so at level 1, you start the game with about 200 health points. The lowest tier, like, dedicated healing item, the med pack, without any skill points into perk, it heals 6% of your health per second for, I think it's 7 seconds. So that's already 12 health points per second. And then over time, and that's the lowest tier dedicated healing item, and at the lowest max health possible. Which, by the way, these dedicated healing items don't have weight. So if you wanted to stack an inventory full of food for instant heals, it would take pretty much your entire inventory, making it useless. There is a skill to like increase the effect of food items, and it's like by percentage wise, but it's like a 10% boost to 5 health points. It's not even 6 health points, you're still at 5 health points. Like, it's that ridiculous. And there is like crafting, and there is better food items, and so then you'll get food items that is like, oh, it's 20 points. And then if you're like maxed out, you can get like a 40% boost. Now you have an item that gives you 28 health points. That's still useless. Some of them do have some interesting effects, like increased carry weight, which, you know, can kind of take the spot of like potions from Skyrim. Although there is chems in Starfield, which I'm gonna get into later. So maybe if you like multiply the effects of the healing items by like 5,
Nice work.
then maybe I could see using them. Maybe even 10, but it's just the way they are right now, it's useless. And which is insane because of the amount of detail they put into them. Other things for fake depth, you have fuel on your ship. I've never had to worry about not having enough fuel to fast travel. And when you fast travel like to one star system, you immediately regain all your fuel, which I don't really understand. So it's basically a feature that does not matter at all, as far as I know. Like, I've gone to the edge of the map and back, the edge of space, whatever the limits of the map are. Like, I've been to the farthest star systems and back. You don't need more fuel than what you basically start with. And since it regenerates, it's not like you have to go and look for it, so it's really pointless. There's a lot of healing items that are supposed to remove these afflictions, like status effects. And there's a lot of different status effects, but they basically do nothing. It's kind of like the food. It'll be like, oh, you have -5 health until you heal your affliction or whatever. Or you run out of oxygen slightly quicker sometimes. The most interesting one that I've seen, the character will cough sometimes. It lowers your oxygen, so it kind of just does like a temporary stamina drain. But then also they just kind of heal over time too, which is bizarre. Then there's environmental damage. Like some planets, they'll have like a toxic atmosphere or no atmosphere, so like solar radiation. So you'll have like a yellow bar that takes up more of your health bar, temporarily lowering your max health, kind of like radiation from Fallout. But there's no like RadAway or anything. The way you get rid of it is just go into a safe area. It just goes away. The only time I've ever actually seen it make a difference in gameplay is there was one area I had to go to where you could basically be in there about 10 seconds or else the yellow bar was maxed out. So I'd run in, look for anything interesting, run out, run back in, look for anything interesting, run out. It turned out there wasn't anything interesting, so that was just annoying. And then probably the biggest issue in terms of fake depth comes from dialogue choices. Dialogue choice isn't nearly as bad as Fallout 4, so this is actually a big improvement. See, in Fallout 4, you had 4 options. You weren't entirely sure what they were going to be, but it was okay because the outcome was almost always the same, minus the fact that your companion may like the dialogue more or less. Not that it matters that much, but then on some occasions you would have dialogue choices that would have slightly different outcomes, and it's the same way in Starfield. More often than not, you have different choices that imply different outcomes, but the outcome's the same. You know, like the NPC's response might be like 2 or 3 words different, but ultimately things still go in the same direction they would either way. And so there's a lot of cases where it's like, oh yeah, you should be able to talk your way out of it, or talk your way into a slightly different scenario or anything like that, and you just can't. Like, you're given a lot of different dialogue options that all give you the same outcome, and that really is just like a big theme with the game, is fake depth. There's a lot of things where it's like, here, look at this RPG element. It doesn't actually impact anything, but it's there. And it's like, if it doesn't impact anything, it's basically not there. Meaningless filler in the game that could have been really cool, but then wasn't. Like, they just gave up on it last second or something. Like, it still is ridiculous to me that they made all of these food items. They could have significantly impacted gameplay. The problem with the food items was literally just the numbers are bad. The numbers aren't balanced for the gameplay, so they ended up being useless. Like, if they just simply tweaked the numbers, they could fix it. So obviously mods are going to fix it and make it interesting, but we shouldn't rely on mods to make the mechanics in the game work. That's ridiculous. Like, it does make it easier to mod, because it's literally just changing the number on an asset that already exists, and then you have something actually interesting there. But it's already there, and they just didn't do anything with it. Like, they were basically like, they told you they did something with it and then didn't. Like, that's what it feels like. It's like somebody gives you an apple and you're like, cool, this looks like an apple. Then you bite into it and it's styrofoam. This isn't an apple at all. Like, that's how a lot of these things feel like. It's like, wow, that looks cool. Then you mess with it and there's absolutely nothing there. It's fake. Dialogue in general is just kind of weird. A lot of times the characters are staring into the camera for some reason. And I don't mean staring into like where you are first person. Sometimes it is them staring into where you are. But the camera moves during conversations. So it's like wherever the camera is, the character's just staring directly into it. And it's very unnatural and weird. One kind of good thing about the dialogue is, specifically with companions, I mean, it's nothing like crazy impressive, but companions will like remember dialogue choices you picked that they liked and sometimes bring them up again. So like maybe you'll have a conversation and they'll bring up something you said where it's like you had 4 options of what you could have told them. And even though there really wasn't any significant outcome to picking the option you picked, besides the fact that maybe the companion liked the option, they bring it up again to kind of make their point for the current conversation, which that is like a very very fine detail. It's like something that didn't need to be in the game, that they included, that actually the game benefits for it, even though it's really small. Yeah, it's if only the dialogue mattered a little more. Oh, and then there's the persuasion mechanic. The persuasion mechanic has you saying different lines, but regardless of what you say, the outcome is either you convinced them or you didn't. Which can lead to really weird circumstances where, like, you convince a person to like you or whatever, like, that's the outcome. Well, so how'd you get there? you threaten to kill their children or something. It's like, what? Because the persuasion options, you go from like the easiest, which has the least impact, to the hardest, which has the most impact. And so the easiest is normally like flattery, but then like the hardest ones are normally something like along the lines of threatening them. So like say you're trying to convince a person to do you a favor or something. And so, you know, the normal way to be like, oh yeah, I like your jacket, you're a pretty cool guy. And then his response is like, thank you, you know what, I am gonna help you. Or he could be like, hey, buddy, I'm gonna eat your face. And then he's like, thank you, you know what, I am gonna help you. Huh? Which, to me, that's another instance of, like, fake depth. It's really not much better than the weird persuasion wheel from Oblivion. Because you literally just have a outcome of it worked or it didn't. Alright, so continuing to talk about, like, dialogue and conversations, right? But rather than from a gameplay perspective, from a writing perspective, a lot of the conversations are really bad. Most of the characters in Starfield are just extremely one-dimensional. But sometimes they'll have 2 dimensions, but it's like almost always it's like they're very connected, they're very obvious. You know, they have a personality trait that you find out the second you meet them, and then they never deviate from that in any way. Like, you'll have like, oh, I'm the responsible person, or oh, I'm the person who makes jokes. It's like, that's kind of their whole deal. And you know, some of them will have a bit more depth to them, you know, as you go through certain quests, but most characters don't. There are important characters, like NPC characters, that you have to interact with regularly that basically have 0 depth, and it's like, how? How did you do this? You know, and it's one thing for, like, an NPC that you only interact with once or twice having no depth. Like, that's okay every now and then. Not every character needs depth. But if a character you're interacting with regularly has no personality besides one personality trait, that's a problem. That's a big problem. And to be honest, I never realized how good the companions in Fallout 4 were. Like, it just wasn't even something I thought about. And I don't think it's something you should have to think about. It's something that happens in the background that keeps you, like, subconsciously compelled to play the game. You know, you really want to find out what happened to this person. But the characters in Starfield are so flat that it made me realize that they actually were good in Fallout 4. And I just didn't even think about it. But it's just like, it makes it hard to care about the characters at all. They like try to have emotional moments, and it's just like, I literally don't care. Like, I would give more examples of like how one-dimensional the characters are, but I don't want to give spoilers. But it's basically like, you can see a character's personality before you talk to them in this game. And you know like exactly what they're gonna do. And then during dialogue, a lot of the dialogue choices you have to respond to people, not only will they sometimes be basically like 2 options that are saying the same thing, but a lot of times they're just bad. Like, I don't know how many times I saw something along the lines of, I don't know what to say during an emotional moment. It's like, I mean, yeah, I guess that's a natural thing to say during an emotional moment, but how many times are you going to use that line? Like, how many times are you going to write the main character in a position to where that's what would be a natural response anyway? You know, the reason why your character is constantly saying that is because people keep like dumping information on you that makes no sense, like why you would tell them that. It's like, hey, you met me 2 days ago, I'm gonna tell you my entire life story. It was very bad. And so then you're just like, oh, weird. I care about you. And then a little thing pops up that's like, they liked that. Cool. The setting of Starfield I actually find pretty interesting. You have these like 2 factions that they're like the countries. They do a lot of good. Like, the game kind of paints them as mostly good, but then they obviously have a bunch of shady stuff that they've done that makes them very morally gray, which that's really not a spoiler. It's, you find this stuff out like before you leave the very first location. So you have like 2 governing factions that kind of controlled like the populated areas of space, and apparently there was like a war between them, but you basically have one that's like kind of like a very organized government and one that's like much more loosely organized. But you have some like interesting cities. Like, you have like an underground city on Mars. You have kind of like a cowboy-esque old west city that's a lot more like loosely run. And then you have this like cyberpunk city called Neon that's on like an ocean planet, and so their economy is like run by fishing, but the fish is a drug. So the city ended up becoming, they call it a pleasure city, and it's powered by lightning because there's just storms on the planet like all the time. And so there's this big dome over the city that gets struck by lightning regularly and it powers the whole city. And it's like, I don't know if that would work, but it's interesting. And then you have other locations like that that are decently interesting. And overall, I would say the setting's good, but then it's brought down a little bit by some really weird aspects of the writing. So like that fish I was talking about, right? Well, so the drug that comes from it is called a chem. They call it drugs chems in Starfield. Chems are from Fallout. That's literally just the Fallout name for drugs. That's not what normal people call drugs. That's not what drugs are called in pretty much any other thing ever. That's just a Fallout thing that was recycled. Why? Why did they recycle the term chems? Why didn't they just call it drugs or come up with a new name if they didn't want to just call it drugs? But then in games, sometimes they literally just call chems drugs. And it makes no sense. Why did they just use... It's just lazy. It's like if you ran into like Nuka-Cola at the bar or something. It's like, what? Or if like the environmental effects were just called rads. Or if FATS was in the game again. Like it made no sense why they would call it chems. Like how many bottle caps do I gotta bribe you with to change the name from chems to something more reasonable? You could even come up with a cool space name. What would a cool space name for drugs be? Space drugs. Yeah, why don't you just call it space drugs? Considering they're illegal, you could go with something like dark matter, you know? It's mysterious. Dark and illegal, and it's stuff. Matter is stuff. Put that dark matter up your nose or whatever. Also, a lot of the chems look like Fallout chems, like they're inhalers, like Jet. It's like, but I mean, okay, we'll give you a pass because inhalers are used for some steroids, which is kind of what the chems are. So okay, and there are other ones, but it's bizarre to me. It's all bizarre. It just feels like they could have done something much better, and then they kind of just phoned it in. The quest writing is not good. Like, it's really not good. Definitely the worst quest writing I've encountered in any of the Bethesda games. You have to wade through a ton of these just like fetch quests, where like the whole quest is literally, oh, we scanned a planet, there's a thing, could you pick it up for us? We would go get it ourselves, but we're not going to. Plus, it's cooler when you do it. So you're gonna go get the thing for us. So yeah, you go and you grab all the things. You gotta grab lots of things. And it's like the first half of the main quest is just going and collecting stuff for people, rather than them doing it themselves, even though they figured out where the stuff is, basically. Or they figured out a vague location. They do explain, it's like, oh, we tried to go get it, we just couldn't find it for some reason. We're incompetent. Like, that was basically the deal. Or, oh, we were gonna go there, but we got distracted. Even though, you know, this is something we've been doing for years, and you literally just joined us a week ago. You care more about it than we do. That's weird. But thank you. But so yeah, a lot of quests are just grab the thing at the end of a small little dungeon or whatever. Or, you know, a lot of quests are like, oh, go talk to this person. Most of the time it's just kind of a boring dead end. There are some exceptions, like there are good quests in the game. It's just, you have to wade through so many bad quests. There are several story quests where there's really not much of a difference between that and literally just going and dealing with some procedurally generated area. And that's not because the procedurally generated areas are good. It literally just feels like the quest was just a procedural area that they made the main story quest for filler. And there's quite a few of those. And then quite a few of the main quests where you are actually doing something interesting, they tend to manage to ruin it by basically being like, oh, you have options, and then it turns out you don't. Like going back to the whole fake death thing again. It's just like, why would you do that? Like, that is incredibly lazy writing. Because the only reason the quest would imply depth that isn't there is because either they were too lazy to add the depth, or they were too lazy to write something actually interesting, and so they just had to basically trick you. And so they had to trick you into make it seem like you're doing something interesting, or like your choices mattered when they didn't. And so despite an interesting setting, the overall story ends up being very bland. I'm not gonna get into any spoilers, of course. You know, the things I will say are things that are touched on in advertisements, and that's that, you know, you join this faction called Constellation. They're like an exploring group, and they're looking for these like metal things that they found that kind of float around or whatever, and they seem to have some powers or something. And so you go into it thinking like, cool, that leaves a lot of room for like something interesting to come about, or there's so many different directions where they could take it. I don't want to spoil it, so I'm not going to give like any real details, but it's just incredibly predictable predictable the whole time. You compare it to like Fallout 4, where Fallout 4, you know, if you didn't already know about Fallout 4's story going into Fallout 4, there were some massive and unexpected twists, and several of them actually. You know, like finding out the deal with the synths and the Institute and a father and the three big factions, and you know, there's a lot going on there. Or on the other hand, you have Skyrim, which didn't really have any twists, but the way they handled the problem was pretty unique most of the time. Like, it wasn't a straightforward, oh, do this. It was, oh, we're gonna capture a dragon with a house. Like, wait, what? What'd you say? With a house? I don't think it works that way. But then it did. It wasn't like a twist. It was just, oh, that's a creative way to handle the problem we had. It wasn't like, oh, you tried to capture the dragon, but then it turned out you were the dragon the whole time. The dragon was the friends you made along the way. No, it was straightforward. You captured the dragon. But it's just a really interesting way to go about it. If you know all the details in the middle, you can figure it all out before you get there, that's a problem. You know, so being able to predict most of the story is not good. And there are a few quests here and there that do handle it in an interesting way, but those quests also seem to be the ones that have the least impact into like the story as a whole, which is ridiculous. So yeah, overall the writing I'd have to say is some of the worst from Bethesda, which is incredibly disappointing. Okay, so this is the area where I think Starfield kind of does the best in. I really like the musical choices they did for the game. You know, it's very reminiscent of like the 2001 Space Odyssey theme, where there's like these horns and it's like very triumphant, but then it goes to like little whimsical bits, and it creates a really interesting like feel to the game, I guess. The music does get pretty repetitive at times, unfortunately. I think it's close to, if not on par with like Skyrim or Oblivion's music. The visuals of the game at times look really, really good. Like, you'll have these areas on like an asteroid where there's just like extremely high contrast because there's no atmosphere spreading the light around. Or you'll have areas where things are dark and foggy and the light's trying to like get through the fog but not quite making it, and so it's really like grim looking. And the city design I really like. Each city has its own feel, which is kind of the norm for like a Bethesda game. But they definitely did a much better job compared to like Fallout 4 in terms of like making each city interesting. You know, you have like the main city, New Atlantis, which it has these like bridges going up in a kind of weird areas, and you know, it has like kind of like a shopping mall area with like these big apartment buildings, but they're like really like classy apartment buildings. And it has like this big waterfall and has these trees and ponds, and it looks very well maintained. And then you have Aquila City, which is like kind of like the opposite, but it still has like a good amount of like verticality to it. It's almost like, I want to say like a castle, like it's kind of like made out of stone. It's like a walled city out in the desert, and a lot of it's like not paved or anything. It's just dirt, like dirt roads inside of this like walled castle pretty much, and then like kind of like wooden looking saloons, so it has like a cowboy vibe to it. And then you have Neon, which I was talking about earlier, which is very like cyberpunk like. And then you have the underground city on Mars, which is also kind of cyberpunk like, but a lot like darker, I guess I would say. It's like very industrial. And then you have some like smaller areas, like there's a little town that's basically like a truck stop. It's an interesting little place to stop by. And there's a few other like locations like that. The other ones are on the smaller side, but each one has like an interesting and unique vibe to it that I really like. In terms of like immersion, you know, there are a lot of like good design choices to increase immersion with this game, like the different details inside of your spaceship, for example. You know, it looks very like lived in for the most part, and so do like other spaceships you visit, stuff like that. And then like the docking is done in like a very realistic way, but then you're constantly like brought out of immersion with the fact that much of the game is very lifeless. In cities, a lot of the NPCs are crowd NPCs, which are literally just there for filler to make it look like you're in a big city. You know, like the type of characters that would be in like GTA, for example, except they don't really react to anything you do for the most part. They'll stare at you, which is really creepy, and they'll sometimes randomly give you like lines about like how they're late for work or something stupid.
Gotta run soon, I'm late to a meeting.
but for the most part, you may as well not have them there, and so like they're useless. A lot of the areas feel really lifeless, and then like all the procedurally generated areas, they have like no lore to them or anything, or the lore that's there is like recycled lore, if that makes sense. Like it's things that you've heard before or seen before. It's like, oh, we were a part of the colony war, or this mine got shut down, our boss was mean to us. Basically not even really lore. And the problem is that it takes up much of the game. Much of the game feels lifeless. So while there are a lot of good designs in it, it's really held back by things like that. You know, it's very different from something like Skyrim, where you show up in Whiterun and like every character kind of has some sort of backstory to them. They all have a house that they live in, and so every building in the city is designed with a purpose. You know, things like that. It's just missing in this game. Kind of has to be missing because the goal is it's on a much bigger scale, but you obviously can't just have an actual city with the detail of Whiterun, at least not with current technology. But I do think you could have made the cities a little bit more dense, used less crowds, but maybe like more crowd ambient sounds to kind of fill up the space like in your head or whatever, or make the crowd NPCs a lot more lifelike, I guess. Because like, you know, you compare it to games with crowd NPCs, like, you know, you have like Cyberpunk 2077 and Red Dead Redemption 2, where like the crowd NPCs, you know, they're obviously not the best AI, but they will go and do a bit more like lifelike things. Like they won't just walk around with a briefcase in circles for 12 hours. They'll have like a bit more variance in what they do, and they're not staring at you all the time. They actually react to what you do when you do something that someone would react to, but they don't react to you when you're not doing something that people wouldn't react to, which I feel like is a kind of a key thing. The crowd NPCs in the game in Starfield stare at you all the time for some reason, and it's bizarre. It's weird. I don't like it. In terms of feel, it definitely could have been better. There's just all these lifeless areas, but I do think there's enough decent areas that it kind of balances it out to some extent. Like I do think I am understating like how well the city design is and like how good the feel is. Like when things work, it's good, right? It's just the fact that half the time it's not. The game as a whole is kind of very hit or miss. The game's okay, but Bethesda can and should do better. The game will probably last a while thanks to mods, but I don't see it being relevant as long as Fallout 4, let alone, you know, Skyrim or New Vegas even. The game has a ton of potential, it's just, it feels unfinished, basically. It feels like they really rushed aspects of it. You know, it turns a game that really should have been a 9, at least, into, I would say, like a 7.5. Maybe an 8 with mods. You probably need mods for it to be an 8. So what I'll say is, if you enjoy playing Fallout 76 single player, then you will enjoy Starfield. So overall, I mean, I would say the game's probably worth getting if you're like a big Bethesda fan, but I do have to say it's probably the worst Bethesda game I've played. It really needed another year. It's an okay game, I guess, you know, and I don't regret buying it. But playing it, I just can't help but constantly be thinking about how much better it could have been, and a lot of the issues with it are so easy to fix, so I know they're going to be fixed by mods. Which the final thing I do want to say is, if you plan on getting the game, I definitely recommend getting it for Steam. You know, if you already have Game Pass, then yeah, play it through Game Pass. But like a lot of the modding capabilities just aren't available for that version. And then who knows how long it's going to take for mods to go to Xbox, and then the mods there are going to be much, much more limited than what you'd get on PC. And I really feel like that's kind of what's going to save this game. Even though I'm normally not the biggest fan of mods, I feel like mods are what's going to save Starfield. And maybe keep it around for like the next 5 years. I do think that's probably going to be around like the next 5 years. I just don't think it's really going to last too much beyond that. You know, I could be wrong. They could have like some big update, or maybe the expansions are going to be like really nice, but overall it's okay, but I'm just kind of disappointed with it. And yeah, I wanted to give you all the details. There probably is some stuff I left out that you might want to know, so I might comment some interesting little tidbits here and there. I actually had like notes for this video, but they're very unorganized. So here I'm going to go read over some stuff that I think I forgot to talk about. Okay, so while some environments do look very good, some environments are extremely ugly, and it's just very random. It's weird. Oh yeah, there's a lot of assets that are like reused between planets, which is very bizarre. Kind of goes back to the whole same animal on multiple planets. You'll see like the same tree throughout various star systems, and then a lot of the trees, even though you're supposed to be able to scan all the different flora and fauna or whatever, there are a ton of plants that you can't scan because they're just kind of there for decoration and they don't provide any resources. But it just is kind of weird. Like you're out looking to scan for stuff and you'll be like in a forest, trees everywhere, and you just can't scan anything or whatever. That's weird. There's also like assets showing up into areas where they really shouldn't. Like you'll be on like a moon that's barren, there's no life on it, you go into a cave and there's tree roots growing into the cave, but there's no trees on the moon's barren, but there's tree roots going through the cave, and it's procedurally generated, so there's obviously like no lore explanation. It's literally just oops. We didn't think that through. Thank you for watching. Seriously, if you made it this far in the video, thank you so much. This took a lot of time to make, so it helped me out a ton if you liked the video and subscribed to the channel. I have quite a bit of future content planned, but I need to account for not being the best at video editing and probably make shorter videos for a while. I'll still try to make like longer videos like this at some point in the future. Just it's probably going to be a little bit. But again, thank you.
Immersion